Good evening. You're watching The Big Picture with me, Ishan Russell. Tonight, we focus on the third India-Africa Forum Summit that is underway in New Delhi. Representatives of 54 African nations, including heads of state and governments of around 40 countries, are participating. Now, there are two documents that are being negotiated. One is a political document, which will talk of the political partnership between India and Africa. It will touch upon global and regional issues. The other, a framework document of cooperation, will talk about the development partnership of Africa and a line of credit by India to African nations. Tonight, though, we focus on the bigger picture of what results this engagement gets and the future roadmap for the African subcontinent and the Indian subcontinent's relationship. I'll request my panelists to be very crisp with the answers as we have a range of issues to cover. And joining me tonight are Siddharth Varadarajan, founding editor of The Wire, Ambassador Jitendra Kumar Tripathi, Dr. Sreeram Chaulia, Dean of the Jindal School of International Affairs, Tom Thomas, CEO of Praxis Institute of Participatory Practices, and Professor Ajay Kumar Dubey from the Center for African Studies at JNU. Ambassador, I'll start with you because you've served in Africa, and given the fact of our historic relations, given the fact that India and Africa, in terms of cultural, in terms of people ties, have been there for some time now. But in terms of the government ties, this summit is really proving to be a watershed moment in that sense, isn't it?
Yes, exactly. I must like to emphasize here that we were late starters as far as country-specific and Africa summit goes, because Japan and China, they started before us. But nevertheless, we picked up very fast, and within the span of 3 IAFS, this is the third one, we have proved that we are not like others. When it comes to Africa, we are not having the relationship of giver or taker or donor and receiver, but we have partnership in progress, and that is what it matters. So that other party also feels that yes, we are not doing any favor to them, but we are helping because they are our brothers. So this is most crucial issue that we have emphasized.
All right. Siddharth, I want to quickly come across to you because the earlier India-Africa Forum Summits were smaller affairs, 12 to 14 countries engagement with those, with 54 countries participating, over 40 heads of state and government over here. What is India hoping to achieve? What is the thought that is behind this? All right, we seem to have lost that connection with Siddharth. We'll try to establish that once again. Dr. Chaulia, putting the same question to you.
Yeah, I think the thought behind it is that we have grown in stature over the last 7-8 years since the first India-Africa Forum Summit was held. We have become more ambitious in terms of our foreign policy under Prime Minister Modi. We want to be what Foreign Secretary Jai Shankar says, a leading nation, and leading especially among emerging nations and developing countries. And all this means that, you know, we have greater convening power, pulling power than before. And earlier, the invites were kept to a select group with whom we had very strong ties and with whom we did practical stuff. But now we believe that we need to have a continental reach across Africa. And I think that's the right way forward, because at the end of the day, to become a great power, India needs to be present across, and it needs to be omnipresent in Africa. And the presence of so many of them here in Delhi this week, it signifies some kind of acknowledgement that India has arrived on a big stage. And therefore, I think although we always emphasize equality, at the same time, it's a kind of a equality of unequals, in the sense that India has greater capabilities than most African countries. So yes, I agree with the ambassador that, you know, it's not giver and taker. We also need to learn from them many things. But at the same time, there are many aspects, economic, strategic, political, where we can give so much. And therefore, I think it's that kind of moment which heralds, I think I call it a watershed in the history of relations among emerging nations.
All right, I want to go across to Siddharth Varadarajan. Siddharth, particularly because, in fact, over here on Rajya Sabha TV also, you've done a series of interviews with various leaders of African nations and various representatives of the very same countries. So what's the mood about India? Because there is, of course, always this talk of competition between India and China going for Africa. There are other, of course, European and American powers that are also targeting Africa. Africa in that sense, in a positive sense. So what do you make of how African nations view India?
Well, the sense I've got from a whole range of interviews that I've done with African ambassadors and leaders over the last week or 10 days is that they want India to play the role of an enabler, of a capacity builder, of an institution builder. One of the ambassadors used the phrase, that India is not simply, India and Africa should not simply have a buy and sell relationship. In other words, that we engage in some kind of cash and carry activity where we go and suck up the resources of Africa and try to sell our own finished products, which is pretty much what the other major economies of the world do. And they said, look, what we want is for India to help African countries establish productive capacity. And there are many examples of this in Tunisia, for example, where India is working with the Tunisian side to essentially, some joint ventures to create units for the conversion of rock phosphates into phosphoric acid and then to fertilizers, which we will import.
Right.
And plenty of other examples across Africa where Indians have gone with appropriate technology and with some sense of creating productive capacity. And I think that's the kind of engagement that African countries expect India to take forward, how we create capacity with our African partners.
Tom, yours is an organization that works in what Siddharth's been talking about being an enabler in that sense in the development sector. What's your experience been working in Africa, and as far as perception about India, is there a sea change? And do you see the right noises being made, the relationship heading in the right direction?
Yes, I think one of the significant things is that there is a huge camaraderie that is there between people of Africa as well as India, and that has been very clear right through most of our interactions. And one significant shift that I have seen over the last say 2 decades of engagements with Africa is that they are not really today asking for food, water, etc. They're asking for more kind of engagement with the experience of civil society organizations and governments in India, in terms of they are talking about how can you help us with governance through transfer of your experience with the local self-governance, your experience of right to information. So there's a kind of a quantum kind of shift in that engagement level between that the communities are asking for today.
All right. Professor Dubey, taking off from what Tom said, and the sense that I get is that every time we talk about India and China and in relation to Africa, it's an unfair comparison then in that sense, because China is focusing on capacity building of a very different nature, where the Chinese companies backed by the government are funding huge infrastructure projects. India, on the other hand, is using its soft power of its people, of skill development and getting into Africa.
Yes, that's true. China has a different advantage. It has huge cash that it can use. It has technology that requires to be deployed at a very larger scale, and it does that in offshore exploration. But India has projects which are much more people-centric. It involves African people, and therefore it is engaged in capacity building and human resource development, which is what India can do and which is what Africans want. And therefore, we have a very different positioning vis-a-vis China. I don't think we can compare with China in terms of size, but we need to understand China because China is eating into the existing goodwill of India. Because if you go to Africa, people talk about Chinese presence everywhere. They give big money. They have projects which are visibles, and they have made roads, buildings, parliaments, African Union building is given by them. So I don't think we can compare given their resources, but we need to understand and we need to make our USP available to African countries. And in fact, they are looking to diversify as much as possible towards India because India is a democratic country, has experience in diversity management, is an ex-colonial country and very friendly with Africa, and its relation is much more older than China.
Yeah. All right, Siddharth, Varadarajan, but the larger picture and that emerges is with 54 nations participating. I wanted to ask you this question earlier as well. What are we hoping to achieve? Is it about the optics of, given the fact that China-Africa summit will be held in South Africa in less than a month, is that one of the reasons why we've gone out with such a big show for the optics?
No, I don't think there's any conscious effort to mimic China or compete with China. The fact is that India and China have both emerged as very significant partners for Africa, but they have quite different core competences. I think the Chinese specialize in the execution of large infrastructure projects, and they have the capital to ensure that those projects get properly funded or financed. India is much stronger on the skill development side, on the software side, on the human resource management side, and I think in terms of creating productive capacities in both the state and the private sector, as well as training, education, healthcare, and so on. So, there is a sense in which both India and China are complementing each other's efforts in Africa, and looking at this as an event being staged to compete or to send a message that we are as good as China, I think doesn't do justice to the kind of effort which is underway. And in terms of the key takeaways, I think it would be good if there is a bigger push for the private sector, which has so far, it's been engaged with Africa and key markets and key sectors. But I think a summit of this kind, which sends a message that the governments of African countries and India are fully committed to this relationship, will, I think, create a better atmosphere for private companies to also then take the plunge. And I think that would be a very significant takeaway, apart from, I hope, some decisions on greater people-to-people relations, educational exchanges, cultural exchanges,
right,
and of course, on some political questions such as the United Nations reform.
Absolutely. The private sector, of course, will be the one that will do that engagement between the subcontinent and the African continent. Dr. Chaulia, has enough been happening on that front? Is the pace enough? And this could, as Siddharth was pointing out, could really prove to be a fillip in a sense over there.
There are some large Indian companies that are invested there, but also I think the key push has to come from small and medium enterprises, because that's where a lot of trade happens, nitty-gritty, which if you add up cumulatively can transform the current bilateral trade way beyond the $70 billion we are right now. Because a lot of small, medium enterprises want to import from Africa and also export specialized products. And all they need is actually exposure. And this, our chambers need to do more of it, chambers of commerce. Of course, the diplomatic missions must enable it. And even educational institutions, because we need to do this on a consistent basis for them to realize that there is value to be gained through exchange. And right now, I think what has happened is most of the experience of Indian businesses there have been positive, barring one or two. And we don't have the negative, ill will that many Africans have developed towards the Chinese. Okay. So I think there's a tremendous opportunity for us to make inroads in small and medium enterprises. And of course, our services sector, agriculture productivity, that's another area which is critical, because there are parts of Africa, especially in Ethiopia today, which are facing drought, and we need to help them, especially with transferring some of these. And of course, I agree with Tom that we need to do a lot more with capacity building of civil society actors, transfer of knowledge about democracy promotion, conflict resolution. These are the things which India has done, relatively speaking, very well among all developing countries, and we have an advantage in it, and I think the Africans will love sharing it with us.
All right, interesting point you make over there, and I'd like to talk about it a little more. But first, Professor Dubey, just taking off from what Dr. Chaulia was also mentioning, as far as the private sector's involvement is concerned, yes, that is happening at a certain pace, and of course, it needs to be hastened. But in terms of what the technology transfer, that is key often, because what the Chinese come and do, they'll set up that building, they'll set up that bridge, but they'll set up the railways for you, but they won't tell you how to operate it. They'll operate it themselves. This is where perhaps India could step in. Is that what the Indian government is trying to do?
Well, Indian government would like to do that, but if it is driven by private sector, then the private sector has to decide how it wants to operate there. They are definitely engaging the local labor in their operations, so that is good part of that. And they are training them in operation of those things. Subsequently, one expects they would like to transfer technology and establish their own subsidiary and regular unit in those countries. So that is possible. But I would like to point out the government-to-government relationship is very good. It's very old. They are a very good partner politically. Business to business is growing very fast, but people-to-people contact is not growing much.
Okay.
And that is where the summit and the government should do that. It must not remain just a bureaucratic initiative. And it must go beyond that. Other sectors, civil society, academics, media, must get connected in order to strengthen this relationship and to transfer the strength that India has in terms of diversity, in terms of development, and in terms of human resources into different areas.
Tom, your organization works on the ground on these particular issues. So in the sense, what do you make of the opportunity? You said that the African nations look towards us for things like democracy, RTI, our successes at that. So what is your sense?
I think there's a huge opportunity, as Professor Dubey was saying. I think that has been lacking in this whole, all the three summits. One thing that was clearly lacking was the presence of civil society organizations. I think rather than looking at civil society organizations as an impediment, I think there's a huge opportunity there for bringing in
what is
ground voices.
sorry for interrupting you, but what's the nature of the existing relationship between civil society organizations between African countries? For example, your organization works over there.
There's a huge amount of camaraderie and relationship that is there between civil society organizations, which has happened. In fact, yesterday we had a roundtable on the whole India-Africa Summit, and we had someone talking from Nairobi to us. And one of the key messages that he was saying was that don't look at our vulnerabilities, look at our potential. There is a huge potential, and we need to have this engagement between civil society organizations, between people to people, and we look forward to that kind of an engagement between India and Africa.
All right, I want to shift attention now to issues of strategic importance, because as far as India and Africa are concerned, of course, terrorism is one thing, Siddharth Varadarajan, that is often talked about. We've seen what the Boko Haram and the Islamic State and how they've mushroomed in various countries across Africa, and India has its own problems dealing with terror, and of course on a global forum we're also trying to talk about it. So in that sense, do we see, as far as terror is concerned, a sort of unity in voices?
You know, terror has become one of those, terrorism has become one of those subjects where, which unites countries, because increasingly more and more countries, more and more areas are falling victim to it. But where, everybody tends to speak with one voice. It's kind of a motherhood and apple pie kind of a response, that we all oppose terror and we must unite to fight it. What matters is practical questions of intelligence sharing, of perhaps sharing best practices and dealing with some of these threats. And there the question arises about whether there are indeed linkages between some of these organizations which are active on the African continent and those that are active closer to India. Boko Haram, for example, is not an organization that has linkages to necessarily even the wider Islamic State, let alone something which is happening in the subcontinent. But I think it's important that countries like India and Nigeria, or Libya, Algeria, Egypt, have a conversation so that there is a working relationship of sorts between our intelligence agencies, law enforcement agencies, so that there is cooperation. And beyond that, it's very hard to imagine what concrete steps could be taken, because the nature of the threats and the nature of these organizations is really quite different.
All right. Also, the fact that as far as from a security standpoint, now we've talked about the Somali pirates. That was an issue that keeps coming up over and over again, maritime security. But Dr. Chaulia, does India have the capacity to, the capability to play that kind of a role in the Indian Ocean that is often envisaged, that is often talked about by columnists?
Absolutely. I think our Navy is in an expansion mode. We have the Western Indian Ocean is basically the east coast of Africa, and it's important. Many African countries are part of the Indian Ocean Rim Association. So we have both trade, which is reflected in the blue economy concept of Prime Minister Modi, but also increasingly security cooperation. We had earlier countered piracy, sent our Navy there, and I think we also will need to chip in with helping resolve some of these regional conundrums that have created and spawned terrorism over time. And frankly, I must say that India must also, at some level, position itself as an antidote to the Western types of interventions that have actually exacerbated conflict and terrorism on the continent.
Okay.
So I think in all these metrics, we are more acceptable and we can play a bigger role. President Buhari is attempting very hard since taking power in Nigeria to counter Boko Haram. Islamic State also, remember, it has two branches, one in Egypt and one in Libya. And they are so-called Islamic State branches also in South Asia. So I think at some level, we are dealing with essentially different faces of the same monster. So I think one is countering terrorism at the UN level through conventions and treaties and getting African votes to back us up, our long call for it. But the other is practical action on the ground, especially to share intelligence, of course, and also to think about how the maritime commerce, as it increases, it can also raise the threat levels in terms of movement of dangerous commodities as well as weapons and illicit drugs which have been moving. So on all these counts, security cooperation with Africa is going to be essential.
All right, it is indeed going to be essential, but we'll have to see as far as the documents that come out from this summit, whether they talk about it, in what fashion do they talk about it. Another thing that the Prime Minister has already been stressing on for some time now and would obviously figure in the conversation is the permanent UNSC seat. India wants these 54 African nations to support it for UN reforms and UNSC seat. Ambassador Tripathi, do you see all 54 African nations following in line? And do you see an impetus in that sense towards India's goal as far as that seat is concerned?
Well, there is impetus surely, but I don't think all of them will fall in line without any exception. You must not forget that South Africa has got its own ambitions. And more than once, South Africa has made it clear that they are the most developed country of the continent, and continent must be given a representation. But that doesn't mean that South Africa will vehemently go against it, because now, going by the scenario, if we go by G4, Japan, India, Germany and Brazil, they also have a good potential candidature. So yes, most of the countries are likely to fall in line, except a few. And maybe if China plays its role there very diplomatically, then few more might oppose. But I don't think, majority will be on Indian side, because they have the experience of Indian assistance or Indian developmental programs, and with that they have a very, very soft corner towards India.
Okay, so that soft corner, I guess, is proving to be a sort of a trump card that we had, that perhaps no other nation has those close ties in terms of people-to-people ties. Final comments, gentlemen, because we just have about 3 minutes, and I'll ask you to outline perhaps one fact that you would like both India and Africa to be working on. And when we talk Africa, it's not just the one continent, it's 54 countries, and they all are pursuing their own national interests. So in terms of out of this kind of an engagement, what do we want that one outcome to be for you, Tom?
I think if you ask me one outcome, I think more of people-to-people engagement, more of listening to the voices on the ground, which actually informs how your aid becomes effective. We've talked ad nauseum about the aid effectiveness and the lack of it, etc. And I think it's a huge opportunity if you talk about a paradigm shift, which is talking about a South-South relationship. I think a key cornerstone of that South-South relationship would be people-to-people engagement. That, I think, we must focus, we must invest in.
All right, Professor Dubey?
I think I would also say what Mr. Tom said, that we need to promote people-to-people relationship. There are various dimensions of that, but two of them I would like to point out quickly. One is the presence of Indian televisions and media in Africa, exclusively for Africa. Chinese have exclusive televisions, and it is widely viewed by African, and therefore we need to do that. The second I would propose is that we have a dormant resource, which is Indian diaspora, which is around 3 million people of Indian origin. We have no policy to rope them in to promote bilateral relations, which suits African country as well as Indian. And African countries should also have policy to use the diasporic resources within Africa, because they have a very strong policy to woo their own diaspora outside. So these are the two things that I would suggest should come out now.
All right, Dr. Chaulia, what about you?
We need freer trade, especially with the sub-regions of Africa, the SADC community in Southern Africa, the East Asian community, East African community, as well as the ECOWAS, which is in West Africa. And these are three sub-regions that need to be integrated. And we also need to support and strengthen African Union institutions at the pan-continental level. Because at the end of the day, if we can build the capacity in peacekeeping as well as in trade facilitation at the African Union level, I think we will be in a sweet spot insofar as India-Africa relations go, because we would have then enabled the continent's rise.
All right, Ambassador Tripathi?
Well, I would say that one thing that this conference, this summit must emphasize is flow of information, correct information between the parties. Because from my experience, I can say that still there is a lack of proper information in African countries, in people, about India and its capabilities and its capacities. So for any good relationship, any stable relationship, it is a must that both parties should know more about each other so that they can take forward from there. So this thing is of paramount importance, and I would like this conference to emphasize on this also. Trade, people-to-people relation, very good we are doing and we must do, but this one, I think this is something that we must emphasize and not forget.
All right, on that note, we'll have to wrap it up. We've run out of time, but thank you all of you for coming in. It was a pleasure to have you, Dr. Chaulia and Siddharth Varadarajan as well. Thank you so much for coming in. So as far as India and Africa, this Forum Summit certainly is proving to be a watershed moment. But let's see how the future is from here on. There's a lot to hope that we can achieve as far as both India and Africa with those 54 countries over there, all very different, all with their different ideas, all with different ambitions, and so does India. So how do these changed ambitions match? We'll have to wait and see. Thanks so much for watching The Big Picture.